Europe is undergoing a transformational shift when it comes to defence spending. After decades of underinvestment, many countries, including Germany, are pumping billions into their militaries as concerns mount over security. But what does all of this mean for the economy? Well, to consider this and other questions, we're delighted to be joined by Mike Schöllhorn. He's the CEO of Airbus Defence and Space and one of the leading voices in the sector. Mike Schöllhorn, thanks so much for joining us here on Deutsche Welle and welcome to the programme.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously so much has changed in the 4.5 years that you've been CEO of Airbus Defence and Space in the defence sector itself. And when you look at the numbers, when we look at a graph and we see the percentage of GDP that different countries like Germany, France, the UK, Poland have been spending historically on their defence and how that's changing at the moment and indeed projected to change over the coming years, going from where they were struggling to hit the 2% mark to trying to hit these new targets of 3.5%, 5%. It's a huge change. How is Airbus and companies like Airbus adjusting to this new reality?
Well, indeed, that's quite a remarkable change that I have personally gone through and that the company has gone through. When I joined mid-21, I think Germany was at a 1.6% of GDP spending. Now we're above 2 already and we aim for 3.5. So that's basically doubling everything that Germany is spending within a relatively short amount of time. For the company, it's meant a major transformation. We came from a time where sort of the spending was meant to sort of keep you in the race, but spread out and delay everything as much as possible. And now the opposite is important. How can we scale up faster? How can we deliver faster? And that's a huge change that's sometimes underestimated in terms of the mindsets of people. What does it do to an organization? I think everybody's fired up and everybody's contributing, but yes, there's some growing pains in this. We've had very strong order intake, typically a book-to-bill of 1.4-ish in the last 3 years. And that needs to be mastered. That leads to a big order book, and now we need to deliver. So big change.
And one of the criticisms of all this new spending that has been clearly pumped in by the German government, among others, in the last few years, and this criticism has been particularly of Germany, that too much of that spending is on so-called traditional defence equipment. So things that are obviously needed, tanks and fighter jets and so on, but that not enough is going towards the kind of innovative technologies which may boost innovation and the economy in the longer term. And just to give you one figure, so Moritz Schülerich from the Kiel Institute of the World Economy, I think he has come up with data that suggests that between 95 and 98% of that new spending since 2022 has been on this traditional tech. So what do you think about this question, this issue?
Well, I know Moritz well, and I know his statement, and I concur with him. I think this is not the end point of what it should be. Now, we also have to recognize that Germany and the Bundeswehr, as the German armed forces, come from a time when there was huge holes in what they should have been able to do in the first place. Those holes need to be plugged. That does, at least initially, require a lot of spending of what you already have as systems. Now, those are not non-innovative, but it's certainly not largely going towards AI, towards unmanned systems, towards all these, let's say, very innovative things. I think that's going to get ramped up pretty significantly in the near future. It's already gearing up. The procurement process is also already getting ready to also do a better job when it comes to these innovative things that you cannot plan so much in advance. So I think it takes a little bit of time. As always, we complain that everything's going too slow. I think there's a reason why the current distribution is what it is, but it has to change.
One of the obvious comparison points with regard to this is obviously the US. And when we look at the data there in terms of venture capital in defence spending and defence tech, I think more than 80% of it over the last 5, 6, 7 years has been spent in the US. So I'm wondering, what do you think needs to change in that regard? And do you subscribe to the idea that more innovative spending, so spending on those things we talked about, would actually have a more meaningful impact on economic growth in the wider sense?
In fact, I mean, it was Moritz who came with the calculation with his institute that the more innovative the spending, or the more towards innovation the spending goes, the more return you have for the economy. Up to 1.6 euros for every euro spent. I think the return ratio is a little less favorable if it's more traditional stuff, even though there is a big return. And I give you one example that is an important thing that we observe in Airbus. A lot of the reasons why Airbus is leading in commercial aircraft is actually coming from the military side. One very simple example, but it's usually important, is the side stick. The A320 was the first aircraft that had a side stick. That came from fighter aircraft. And we've seen a lot of these mutual benefits and this crosstalk between defense innovation and commercial innovation. But I agree with Moritz Schöllhorn that if it's more towards areas that we have not been so good at in other sectors of the economy, the benefit would be greater. And I think then it also can be a lasting effect.
And clearly the backdrop to so much of this is the war in Ukraine. Can you give me the perspective of someone in your position as the CEO of a major defence firm as to how much what's been going on the battlefield in Ukraine has affected your business in terms of production, the kind of things that are needed to succeed on a modern battlefield?
I would say there's the direct effect, which is coming from the battle, from the war in Ukraine itself, and then there's the indirect effect. The indirect effect is, I guess, what we have talked about in the interview so far, is it has been the reason, one big driver of why the defense budgets were upped, and why we have now all this money available to invest. So it has been a big driver in that regard. If you look at the more practical, how is the war fought in Ukraine and what can we learn from it and how does it affect technology and companies, the obvious first thing was space. Space was the means with which the Russian amassed troops could be seen and there could be predictions in terms of would something happen or not. I think politicians have learned how important space is, not only for warfare, but for almost everything that we have in a modern economy. So that has been a huge effect in terms of discussions, but also business and orders and technical developments in that area. The other obvious thing that comes to mind is drones, unmanned systems, or uncrewed systems, to speak in general. There is a big learning coming from that these uncrewed systems, especially when they provide relatively inexpensive mass, combat mass, will be a factor that will not go away. It will amplify, it will get more. So to the very exquisite systems that typically have been the guarantee for the West, for NATO, to always have a leg up in the past over potential adversaries, I think we need to add the mass component. So that's not going to go away. On the other hand, I would say, if we only look to Ukraine and forget, for instance, conflicts like Rising Lion, Israel, Iran, we also need to learn from those. And it was extremely sophisticated and complex systems that made the difference there. So I don't think NATO and Germany and Europe should be aiming to have to defend itself like Ukraine has to, because there's nothing else available. So we need to also have the upper hand in terms of technology, in terms of space dominance, in terms of air dominance. But we also must not forget that the affordable mass is becoming a huge factor.
I want to move on now to another area. So a word that we commonly hear when we talk about EU problems, economic or otherwise, is fragmentation. It's obvious that when you have 27 different governments, it's very hard to work together in the same way that someone like the US, one government, can work. Just first of all, can you tell me how much of an issue is this at present in practical terms for the defence industry in Europe?
Well, it is still a huge issue. I mean, all these factors, if you look at major battle systems, from tanks to aircraft to ships to whatever, the average is that the US, which still has a significantly higher defense budget than Europe, at least as we speak. Europe, on the other hand, has 5 times more number of systems or types of systems. So we sprinkle less money over more systems, and that provides a factor of more than 10x. It's actually more in the ballpark of 50x in terms of money per system. So of course the US is better at scaling, is better at driving the cost point down, and that's still a huge issue in Europe. I think it's recognized, and politicians have talked a lot about it. I think we need to be very careful that with all the money that's now being made available through national budgets, the reflex to then have that geo-return into your own country is not amplifying the problem. I think I see signs of that. So I think it's something that's not very healthy. On the other hand, there's companies like mine that exists and that were created exactly to help fight fragmentation and come to European projects of scale that can then help improve the situation.
Well, on that note, we visited the Eurofighter facility close to here, and that's clearly a very good example of this type of cross-border collaboration within Europe. But Airbus is also involved in the FCAS program, the Franco German program, which is now 10 years old in its conception, but which does not seem to be working out at the moment. What can you tell us about how that project is going and what that tells us about the problems affecting this collaboration, which we clearly need between the likes of France, Germany and the other major European defence powers?
Yeah, not totally unexpected, the question, but let me start with the statement that Future Combat Air System, FCAS, is much more than a plane. It's much more than a fighter aircraft. It is a combat cloud at the very core of it. It is unmanned systems. It is sensors. It's simulation capabilities, and most of that is working extremely well. Yes, there's a problem in the manned fighter between two companies. Mine is one of them. It's a reminder that if you start on these big European projects, it takes more than the political will. It takes the industrial alignment of the players involved. We have that in Eurofighter. We have that for other big programs that we have, like A400. We have that in many cases in space. In FCAS, I think we're still struggling with it. But if we assume that we end up with two fighters in a bigger project that has all these other assets and other means, then that wouldn't be the end of the world. It wouldn't be the end of Franco-German-Spanish collaboration, and it would actually make FCAS more resilient.
Because there have been reports that FCAS is on its last legs. I mean, they haven't been confirmed, but what can you tell us? I mean, is there any prospect?
There will be an FCAS. There will have to be some restructuring in certain parts of the project. It was defined, let's not forget, in 2017, at the height of probably the peace dividend period, with probably not so much in mind that we would ever potentially have to use these products and systems that come out of it. We have a totally different world now, and now speed is of the essence. The times where you could define something very precisely with long requirements lists that would then come 15 or 20 years later are over. The speed of change is so rapid that we also need to change the mode of how we develop things, so there's a restructuring of FCAS needed anyways.
You mentioned the peace dividend. There will be people watching this program, perhaps in Germany or other parts of Europe, who are concerned about the kind of defence spending numbers that we're seeing, and they probably think about things like, well, I liked it when governments had more money to spend on social care, on health care, on education perhaps. This perception of what a peace dividend means. What's your view on that? Do you think that those concerns are in any way justified, that too much has been spent on defence?
I understand the concerns. I think we all would wish a world where we have enough money for the elderly, for health care, for education, for university, for everything. And it's not that Europe is now, not spending anything anymore to up their game in defense. But if we flip the logic and we say, like, what if we were to continue where we come from, grossly underspending on defense? We're facing an adversary, and the Ukrainians are actually fighting for their very existence and their very values in their democracies. I don't want to be in that situation. I think the spending in defense goes towards deterrent, and deterrence of a potential adversary, and the better we do that, the more we can secure that our children and their children can also enjoy what I hold very, very dear in my heart, and that's a Western democracy. It's a liberal way of speaking. It's having people that have a totally opposite opinion, who our armed forces also fight for their freedom to speak up. So I think it's not an either or. I think we need to do both. But we have definitely underspent on defense now, in the past. We now need to catch up. How long will it last at that level? I don't know. I don't think it will go away anytime soon, but hopefully we'll come to a time when it maybe equals out, potentially at the old famous number of 2% of GDP.
And then just finally, Mike, obviously no one can underestimate the seriousness of the challenge that the people of Ukraine have faced for the last 4 years. And I don't think anyone can underestimate the seriousness of the threat that we here in Western Europe and other parts of Eastern Europe and so on also possibly face. But if we take an optimistic view on that, what's your view in terms of the longer term economic consequences of all this spending in your sector? Do you think that it can have longer term positive economic effects, or does something drastically need to change in order for that to happen?
Well, the short answer is yes. You look at countries like the US or like Israel that have been extremely successful in turning defense spending into overall economic growth and prosperity and leading edge technologies. Israel wouldn't be where it is today as a startup nation without their big defense spending. Europe's not yet there. Europe has to learn that. That also means, as I said before, and you asked, we need to direct more of the defense spending into very innovative systems. then we're going to have a longer lasting effect. But we also need, at least as far as we need to catch up, we need to spend some money on the let's say, current and sometimes even legacy systems to just close the biggest holes. So I think there's a bridge to connect the two.
Mike Schöllhorn, the CEO of Airbus Defence and Space, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thanks for having me, Arthur.